It's June the 25th, 2022. Welcome to our Saturday Bible reading series in the book of Revelation. And we've got today to chapter 14. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven, like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they kept themselves pure. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among men and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." A second angel followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives his mark on the forehead or on the hand, he too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. He will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and his image, or for anyone who receives the mark of his name. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus." Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Amen. Well, here we are in the book of Revelation, chapter 14, a chapter that naturally breaks down into two major sections: the triumph of God's church and the judgment of the wicked. First of all, the triumph of God's church, verses 1 to 16, or the blessedness, we might say, of the saints in heaven, because that's where these people are. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. Mount Zion is always symbolic of heavenly glory, and the 144,000 are there. Now, we've seen these people before. Remember back in chapter 7, the great sealed multitude, all the saved, all the saints, all God's elect. In chapter 7, we saw them on earth. Here they are in heaven, enjoying their ultimate triumph and blessedness in the glory of heaven. This precise and highly symbolic number, this perfect number, is not to be taken literally. It is symbolic. And the point is, they've arrived. They are in heaven, enjoying their triumph. The ones who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads, as opposed to the mark of the beast in chapter 13 on his right hand or on his forehead. Chapter 13, verse 16. The worshippers of the dragon, the ones controlled by the beast. The great ultimate contrast between these two groups in the human race. And everything that the dragon could throw at them, do you remember in chapter 13, working through those beasts, through the political and religious anti-Christian systems of this world, all of that's been thrown at them, and they still got through. Here they are at last, and not one of them has been lost. And so, understandably, they are singing. As we hear a sound from heaven, verse 2, it's the sound of singing. They sang a new song. Why is it a new song? Well, they've never sung God's praises and the praises of the Lamb in his immediate presence before. And everything they hoped for, every promise that they believed, is now being fulfilled. That's what makes it so new. It's a description of them, verse 4, as virgins. They didn't defile themselves with women. Again, probably not to be taken literally. If you have a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 2, and this is a fairly common way that Paul has of describing the church as a pure virgin that he was devoting to Christ. And that's the idea. The faithful ones, the blameless ones, the devoted ones. And he uses the expression at the end of verse 4 that they are the first fruits from among men. All of these descriptions describe the 144,000, which is a way of talking about the whole church, the whole people of God. Verses 6 to 9, the scene changes now again from heaven to earth. There are a number of angels now who come. They are the servants of God. This might be symbolic, actually, of the church and of the ministry of the church. Sometimes we are called angels. It simply means messenger, a messenger of the Most High God. But let's take it that these are actual angels, or certainly in the vision. And their main ministry, even though the church will ultimately, perfectly, and all of God's people be in the glory, that's what verses 1 to 5 is all about. But what's going on earth? What's going on earth? Well, there's still a battle, there's still a struggle, there's still a ministry to the people of this world, warning mankind with words like verse 7. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come." That's the message of the angels. That's the message of ministers, of God's people, of the church right now in this world. A second angel comes along, verse 8. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. The whole world system with all its false religion and anti-Christian politics, the beasts that we saw in chapter 13, described here as Babylon, of course, great symbolism going back to the Old Testament. The angel speaks as if it is fallen. Well, I think what we can say is this world is under judgment. It's as good as fallen. It's corrupt, and it will be brought down, the whole system. And we'll have a whole chapter on that coming up soon in chapter 18. And what about those who are entangled in this world system, attached to it? They've taken the mark of the beast on their hand, as we saw before, on their right hand and on their foreheads. What about those who worship the dragon? Well, there'll be no hope for them on that final judgment day. People like that, verse 10, he will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. There will be never-ending torment for the worshippers and the followers of the dragon. But verse 12 and following, this perfect judgment upon the enemies of God will be strangely encouraging for the people of God. Verse 12 and following, to be patient, to keep obeying, to be faithful to Jesus, verse 12. The encouraging words of verses 13 and then verse 14, the revelation, the image of this man. He's like a son of man with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. This heavenly vision, this seems to be the Lord Jesus Christ coming for harvest. But there are two types of harvest. Verses 14 to 16 seems to be the harvest of God's people, which we're told in the earlier part of the chapter will happen. It's perfect. It's as good as done. We're just unfolding God's purpose. That perfect number, 144,000, so significant there. But as well as the harvest of God's people, finally, verses 17 to 20, the second part of the chapter, there's the harvest, the judgment of the wicked. So this is the second and final part, just briefly as we close. This is the final judgment. This harvest, which is twofold, bringing in the elect, bringing in all of God's chosen people. None shall be lost, despite what the world has done, the flesh has done, the devil has done, the beast, the two beasts have done. They've thrown everything at God's people. But we have persevered because God has persevered with us. We keep the commandments of God because he keeps the promises that he's given from God to his people. And so we have the harvest of the Lord's people, but also then the harvest in judgment of the wicked. The angels coming, more angels, instruments, ministers, servants of the Son of Man upon his throne. And the chapter ends in a very strange way, doesn't it? The grapes which will be, as it says, gathered, thrown into God's winepress, trampled in the winepress outside the city. And it's actually talking about judgment, the blood flowing out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia, 180 miles. What on earth is all this about? Well, I turn for help to William Hendrickson if you want to do more reading on the book of Revelation. This is the sanest and the most spiritual commentary I know. Just listen to him as he explains these last few verses to us. The vine of the earth symbolizes the entire multitude of evil men. Its grapes are the individual unbelievers. Just as grapes are trodden, pressed, crushed, so the wicked are going to be destroyed and punished everlastingly. The grapes are cast into the great winepress of the wrath of God and crushed. In the picture that John sees, a lake of blood results. It's so deep that horses can swim in it. It spreads out in all directions to the extent of 1,600 stadia. Listen to this now. Remember that 4 is the number of the universe and the earth. This is the judgment of the wicked. 10 is the number of completeness. So 1,600, which is the product of 4 times 4 times 10 times 10, would seem to indicate that this is the thoroughly complete judgment of the wicked. And the winepress of God's wrath was trodden down outside the holy city. The perfect triumph of God's church, the perfect judgment of the wicked, because God is perfect and all his ways are perfect.